We are back with the D.Y. Patil lecture series, and now, of course, like all of you know, we have moved to the online platform, and it has been a very, very positive experience so far. We have received a lot of good feedback. The online platform has actually served to be a bit of a boon for many people who initially had difficulty getting to the venue because of time constraints or physical distances, etc. And a lot of people from out of town, a lot of senior consultants are also logging in now on a regular basis because this has turned out to be an open forum for everybody. So it's a great opportunity, and we have been blessed with very good speakers, very good discourses. And to continue the trend, we have a very, very dear friend of mine, senior colleague. We've studied together at Nair, and he is my go-to person for anything that I don't understand about psychiatry, and he can testify to the fact that there are tons of things I bother him about. So I don't understand a lot of things yet, but he helps me shift through the challenges quite well. And of course, it's my proud privilege to introduce him to you, Dr. Malay Dave. He's a consultant in private practice since 1997, and he has been the past president of the Bombay Psychiatric Society in the term of 2016 to 17. He has been the project coordinator of the Autism Dynamic Interventions Unit at the Department of Psychiatry at Nair Hospital from 2008 until 2017. There's a 10 years of illustrious trail that he has left behind, and today the department is much the richer for his contributions. He is the quintessential quiz master. He has been the quiz master at ANSIPS from 2017 till date. He has been the quiz master for all of us for a long time, even earlier. He is a co-author as well as an author of various articles and book chapters. And his areas of interest are neuroscience and genetics. And one of his biggest skills is a very good teacher and an extremely good lecturer. And without any further ado, I invite Malay to take over the proceedings. And trust me, he is one of the best guys out there. So make the most of it and have a good session. Over to you, Malay.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Rashmin, for the kind words and inviting me for another lecture in this series. I'll start sharing my screen. Am I audible?
Just one small housekeeping. I still see a lot of people who haven't muted themselves. So we shall do that by default. But please mute yourselves. All right. Malay, I'm going to mute everybody, so you might get muted as well. Please unmute yourself in case that happens.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, Malay, please unmute yourself and then you can take over.
Yeah. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah, and am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So
over to you, Malay.
Okay. So we'll start with the topic today, that is psychoneuroendocrinology, or PNE in short, because it's too big a term. And I'll be talking about it. Now, there are these two quotes which are attributed to Albert Einstein, which make a lot of sense when we are looking at where psychiatry is heading. First, I do not believe that a good Lord plays dice. So nothing happens by chance. Chance as in, we don't look at destiny here, so to say, or any astrological predictions. And the second one is, I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are details. So basic idea is, how does the brain work? At least that is what is pertaining to our specialty. What is the framework of things? How are disorders caused? Believe me, after all these years, we still don't have much of a clue. But that is what the whole idea is. If we have a framework of etiology of how psychiatric disorders are caused, what are the contributory systems that finally lead to the phenotype of, let's say, delusions, hallucinations, and so on. Well, the rest are all details. The details will keep on accumulating, changing. But if you have a framework, the understanding of details and where to put them in their proper place becomes easy. So we'll start with the disclaimer. First of all, this is an overview of entire physiological system. So it is not one small topic or one small chapter. There are many systems involved. So it's going to be an overview. We cannot go into too many details or rather any details about anything. So it is going to be in bits and parts. If I might miss out something, the listeners, please feel free to contribute. And if you do not want to contribute now, then the third thing is that the presentation is designed to motivate the listeners to take a step forward to learn by themselves. I am 100% sure that I will not be able to cover all the 100% of this topic. I have not received any honorarium or payment for this presentation, so I'm quite clear I'm not promoting any drugs or anything like that or any modality of treatment. And we can have some questions at the end of the presentation. I think we can. You can put the questions in the Q&A or the chat function of Zoom. So I have divided the topic into this following headings. So what is psychoneuroendocrinology? Some basics about hormones. The three axes, the HPA, that is hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, the gonadal axis, and the thyroid axis. Then we have this other group of hormones, the POMC, growth hormone, somatostatin, others, and then a few clinical implications as probably would apply to what we have discussed. So what is psychoneuroendocrinology, or PNE in short? So before I begin, let me tell you one thing. I have designed this presentation basically for the postgraduates. So my basic standard reference would be our standard textbooks, the CTP and the synopsis. So unless otherwise written, all this is from there. And I have added a lot of other references to make it very recent, very appropriate, and very cutting edge. The point being that if you do not remember everything, at least you will have a revision of what needs to be read from the exam perspective. And for those who are interested, there are a lot of references. You can pick up any and you can do your own reading. So what is PNE? It's basically a structural and functional relationship between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So as I said, this is going to be a review of two systems. So it's not a very easy thing to do in, let's say, an hour or so. Our behaviors modulate both these systems. So it's a kind of a dynamic interaction between our behaviors and how these behaviors have an effect on these two systems. Both these systems, they integrate to produce different kinds of behaviors. So how does that happen? The brain leads to the production of hormones, so to say, or the super control of hormones, which lead to the final hormones. And these hormones have an effect on the body as well as the brain. And the most important thing is the last one. For all these years, we have considered psychiatric illnesses as something which is just a collection of symptoms that we see in the different diagnostic or categorical systems. Where we fail to understand is that psychiatric presentations are just one part of the whole phenotype in an individual, who can have a lot of other symptoms also, which we do not really take into account. If I may say so, I don't think that I have seen a single patient in my practice who doesn't have a sleep problem, whatever be the psychiatric diagnosis. The question is, we take it as a part of a psychiatric disorder or a diagnosis, but we fail to understand as to why that disorder is associated with a sleep problem. Now, sleep and the chronobiology, that is the circadian rhythmicity, is a different topic altogether. But the idea is that the moment you look at sleep in a little more detail, you would come to know that there are a lot of factors that mediate normal sleep, sleep patterns, abnormal sleep, and so on. And that is a contributory factor to the pathology of the psychiatric illness per se. It is not just a symptom. It is not just a presentation. It is a lot more than just a symptom. Secondly, After the atypical antipsychotics became major players in the treatment of psychosis, we have a host of people who develop the metabolic syndrome. That is, they put on a lot of weight, they have got glucose, they have abnormal glucose handling, they are borderline or frankly hypertensive, they develop type 2 diabetes, and so on and so forth. Now, this metabolic syndrome is not just out of the blue. It is also a system which gets affected in psychiatric illnesses, but we never paid attention to it till in those susceptible individuals who, when exposed to antipsychotics, atypical ones, they started putting on weight. So what we need to understand is that the psychiatric phenotype of an individual is one phenotype of a wide variety of disturbances in various other systems. And how do we reconcile all this is when we look at PNE in some detail. So let's start some basics about hormones. So basically, we are not going to go into a textbook picture of endocrinology. We are not going to go into too much details about or too many details about hormones, but let us see how they are, what is their role. One is pleiotropy. Now, what happens is that pleiotropy means that more than one action. And what does it mean? Is that as we evolved from unicellular organisms to multicellular organisms like what we are now, the systems remained similar. I would not say that we have the same system as a monocellular amoeba, but the systems being in place now will do different roles and more roles than what it was initially designed for lower down the evolutionary scale. So that is pleiotropy. Pleiotropy means a system which has got more than one action. So hormones, if you look at, let's say, thyroid hormones, they are okay. I mean, yes, we have learned in MBBS that they deal with energetics and things like that, but they have got some additional effects when it comes to the brain. That is called as pleiotropy. Plasticity. Plasticity would mean that when we do something again and again, certain changes happen at a synaptic level, at a neuroendocrine level, at a genetic level, by which that learning remains. It becomes a part of our repertoire of behavior. So hormones play a very important role when it comes to the plasticity aspect of behavior. And both the neurological part as well as the endocrine part of an individual are responsible for the complex behaviors. For us, all behaviors are complex, whether it is eating, sexual behaviors, sleep behaviors, everything is very complex. What are the classes of hormones? Two basic types: peptides, that are proteins, and steroids. About the synthesis in short, peptide hormones are proteins, so they will develop, or they are synthesized as prohormones, which is a bigger molecule. And then by cleavage of certain protein part of certain components of the prohormone, we'll get the final acting hormone. So we have the POMC, or the pro-melanocortin, which when cleaved leads to 4 precursors: ACTH, beta endorphin, beta lipotropin, and MSH. And the steroid hormones like ACTH and gonadotropins are synthesized within the cell around a cholesterol ring. So they can either be synthesized fast in the mitochondria with the help of the mitochondria, or they can be a slow synthesis, which is more at a genetic level. Hormone secretion typically follows this kind of a pattern. At a hypothalamic level, we have the release hormones. At the pituitary level, we have the tropic hormones. And then the target cells in those target endocrine organs will produce the final hormone. And this secretion is controlled by feedback loops. And how do these hormones act? Autocrine. So basically they'll act on that one cell itself, bring about changes in the cellular function. Paracrine, which is an effect on a small group of cells or nearby cells. And endocrine function, as we know of, effects on the whole body, including the brain. So when we look at the cells, the effects can be on the genome or the DNA. So this is basically the function of steroid hormones. So we have glucocorticoids, estrogen, testosterone, thyroid hormones. They bind to intracellular receptors, so they're internalized, and this receptor goes and attaches to the nuclear membrane. Then there is an action on the DNA, there is an alteration in the transcription and the final protein output. Or apart from a genetic direct effect on the DNA, there can be an epigenetic effect also. So basically transcription factors of C, FOS, C, Jun, etc. These are modified and the final output is there in terms of proteins. It is a slow process. So there are some hormones which have a fast effect if they are acting on the non-genomic part, and a slower effect if they are acting on the genomic basis. So the non-genomic ones are faster. They bind to the membranes, cellular membranes, and they can act as coagonists or antagonists. So neurosteroids, GABA-A, they will alter the membrane fluidity and allow a lot of other ions to enter or exit the cell. Some hormones like glucocorticoids have a combined action. So they have a non-genomic, which is a fast one, which helps in the fight or flight response, and a genomic delayed one when metabolism has to be maintained when the stress becomes a chronic one. We'll come to that later on. Hormones have tissue-specific actions. Certain tissues can convert a prohormone into other hormones. Basic idea is that they will work on tissues that are primed to receive those hormones. And the patterns of activity are tonic or diffuse. So there is a certain level that has to be maintained for the hormones, below which the body functions, the physiological functions get affected. Hormones can have a pulsatile effect, means they can be pulses. There is a steady level and there can be pulses. So hormones that are associated with circadian rhythmicity will have a pulsatile action, like melatonin. Basically, all hormones have got a pulsatile activity. There are different peaks for different hormones at different at times in the 24-hour circadian cycle. And then there are, of course, genetic differences. So what happens when there is an exposure to a hormone? So with previous exposure to a hormone, I can now have a decreased response, which is called as habituation. I can get sensitized to a response where the response is enhanced. Or I can get dishabituated, means a different stimulus than the regular one can cause an enhancement of response. These are from animal studies, but what happens basically is like, let's say if the next part is about the HPA axis, what happens with cortisol? So cortisol has got circadian rhythmicity because it is connected, the control, the synthesis and all that is connected to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. There is habituation, means the stress response is not the same with each exposure to stress. And then there is a feedback control. Hormones are also important from the organizational perspective. So gonadal hormones are responsible for the masculinization or the feminization of the brains. This happens in certain different parts like the corpus callosum and so on. Thyroid hormones also have organizational effects in the sense for neural development. We'll see that later on. Prenatal exposure to stress, okay, let's say in utero exposure to some kind of deprivation, let's say nutritional deprivation. Steroids, glucocorticoids can have lasting effects on the immunity, cardiovascular functioning, and so on. There is also epigenetic transmission. So if these hormones have an epigenetic effect on the developing fetus, then the effect can turn out to be long-term. For example, if you look at something like this, now this is an often debated question, and I think all of us have been asked sometime or the other, either by our patients or in different discussion forums. What about drugs in pregnancy? So there's one study, 2012 study, risk of adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes in women treated or not treated with mood stabilizers for bipolar disorder. So two group of patients who were treated, patients who were not treated. So what they concluded was that there's an increased risk for several poor obstetric and neonatal outcomes in both the groups. But mood stabilizer is not the sole reason for increased risk factors or increased adverse pregnancy outcomes and birth outcomes, because the disorders themselves can have an independent effect of poorer obstetric and pregnancy outcomes. What we are trying to say is that whenever a psychiatric disorder is going on in the mother, it is not only happening in the mother's brain. Her systems, her neuroendocrine axes are getting affected, and that is the effects are getting sort of transmitted to the developing fetus, either direct effects or epigenetic effects, and the outcomes are not that good. So early life stress, HPA, I mentioned about what happens with early life stress. So there is some kind of an HPA axis adaptation and later health outcomes. So what is happening in utero will probably decide what an individual is going to suffer later in life from. Something like this, early life stress in terms of psychological or nutritional insert, MDs, maternal deprivation, maternal mother not being present, or low nutrition, and acts through the HPA axis, if I can show you here. And there are other mechanisms which are not very clear. But when the HPA axis is primed, it is going to have all these kinds of effects, including insulin resistance, right? And might predispose the individual to develop a metabolic like syndrome or a cardiovascular insult right from in utero. What we are trying to understand is, as I said before in my disclaimer, is that psychiatric disorders are probably just one phenotype. A psychiatric disorder is probably happening, developing in an individual with an effect on other systems as well. And we actually don't know when it has started. When we look at a patient, we look at when the symptoms started, but that symptoms is the final end point of a presentation of all these processes that are happening in that individual. So we come to the HPA axis. I am starting with the HPA axis because it is one thing that we need to know in some detail. Second thing is that a lot of questions time and again have been asked on this system. So let us have an idea of what it is. So basically, it's the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis, and this axis actually combines the brain, roughly, that's the central nervous system, along with the autonomic nervous system to the various organ systems. The main being the hypothalamus here, that is in the brain, pituitary below the hypothalamus, and the adrenals. But this is just an anatomical outline of how the system is and how it works. So these are the parts of the HPA axis, right? But this is the kind of hard wiring that is involved in the HPA axis. So diagrammatically, it is like this. Again, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, ACTH, adrenals, cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and the effects. Now, what we need to understand from the general outline of hormones is that there is going to be something called as a release hormone from the hypothalamus, a tropic hormone, release hormone is CRH, tropic hormone is ACTH, and cortisol. So 3 levels of substances or 3 levels of chemicals or hormones, so to say, and each will have an effect on the other. These are called as feedback loops. So cortisol will have an inhibition on the anterior pituitary and so on the hypothalamus, but it will stimulate the metabolic effects, and this will have certain independent effects also. So the sum total is wherever there is an external stressor, whether it's a physical stress, emotional stress, fever, hypoglycemia, hypotension, you name it, or a circadian rhythm disturbance, and that has an effect on the hypothalamus and the system gets affected. This is the rough outline of the HPA axis. So when we look at stress, we are all fond of talking about stressors. This stressor happened and the patient got depression, and that stressor happened and the patient did something else and something. But what does it actually mean? Excuse me. What does it actually mean in terms of neurobiology or PNE? So the CRH, ACTH, and cortisol are all elevated due to stress. This is homeostatic and adaptive. Glucocorticoids are anabolic. Glucocorticoids means the ACTH, the final output of adrenals, they are anabolic, means it speeds up glucose metabolism, increases the blood pressure, produces an inflammatory response, enhances lipid metabolism, flight, fight, memory, everything. But they also modulate pain and sleep. And hormone responses varies with individual coping. So this individual coping is genetically determined because there are so many components in the HPA axis that each component will have a kind of a spectrum of functioning, and multiple components will have multiple spectra of functioning. So the final output will be determined by that, basically the genetics of an individual. So what happens with chronic stress? The CRH is elevated and also arginine vasopressin. There's a downregulation of CRH receptors in the anterior pituitary. It's logical. But there is a simultaneous activation of locus coeruleus. So there is a sympathetic overactivity, and the sympathetic overactivity stays. So there is hyperarousal, selective attention, and a reduction in vegetative function. So lack of sleep and appetite. Now, in the initial part, when the stress is acute, it is fine. It can come back to normal. But when the settings over a period of time get impaired, then the same simultaneous activation of locus coeruleus leads to chronic persistent sympathetic hyperactivity and increased sympathetic tone and hypertension, for example, and tachycardia, for example. Now, ACTH will gradually reduce over time. It cannot stay at that level. What stays elevated is the cortisol. So what happens with chronic HPA axis dysregulation? So we have a perceived stress, all these are involved, but final outcome as a patient perceives or we perceived is relationships, problems with the relationship, lack of control, burnout. But this is what is going on. These are the impairments that are happening. Glycemic dysregulation, the final activity may be low physical activity, obesity, but the bottom line, what has happened in the base, in the basis is insulin resistance, problems with impaired immunity. So IL-1 beta, IL-6 and TNF alpha involved. Sleep issues, so shift work, jet lag, daylight savings, whatever you can say. So all these are getting affected. Types of glucocorticoid receptors are two: mineralocorticoid MR and glucocorticoid GR. At low steroid levels, that is initial stress, we have the MR which get stimulated, and at higher levels, when there is that later response, habituation and sensitization, the glucocorticoid receptors are involved. And with continuous stress, as I said, there is sustained hypercortisolemia and metabolic changes. What are the feedback systems? These are the fast, intermediate, and slow ones. The fast ones will be more acute, and the levels of glucocorticoids are rising, and it will regulate CRH and ACTH release. Intermediate will come within few hours and are dose sensitive, and again they will inhibit CRH and ACTH. And then there's a delayed slow feedback, which is also similar and inhibitory. Other factors to take into account: serotonin and acetylcholine actually amplify the glucocorticoid release, so that is the input from these neurons from the stress. GABA and opioids inhibit. So one of the so many times when patients are too stressed and anxious, acute, we are not able to diagnose anything. Something happened and anxious. The best thing is give some benzodiazepine, they'll come down. Acutely, glucocorticoids will stimulate dopamine receptors. Chronically, they'll reduce the activity of dopaminergic receptors. Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
You're not audible now, Malay. I think things are better now. Can see your screen. Malay, say something.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
fine.
can see you, can hear you.
Okay, fine. Right. So this whole system is under genetic control. This is a diagram which shows that there was an experiment done in mice where there was a GR deletion. The genes which code for glucocorticoid receptors were mutated, and actually they produced mice which had an impaired negative feedback, HPA axis hyperactivation even when there was no stress, decreased locomotor activity, Cushingoid phenotype, growth impairments, increased adiposity, hair loss, and fat distribution. So this I had put to re-emphasize the fact that the HPA axis response to stress is genetically determined. There are a lot of factors which come into play, and this experiment is only for gene, one gene polymorphism. There are many. I have not put the whole list of things. Clinical implications, yes, including mood disorders, PTSD, dementia, substance use disorder. We know about Cushing's disorder and Addison's disease. They are pure endocrine disorders. The idea was that if the HPA axis is involved in so many disorders, we must have some kind of a test or a marker to see if we are able to pick these patients up, because they would mean a separate subtype of patients, and we can maybe modify our treatments or tailor our treatments to meet their needs. So we had the dexamethasone suppression test, which is basically of historical importance as of now, because it was not a very robust marker. There are a lot of other factors apart from which contribute to hypercortisolemia, not only the individual internal state of the individual. Basically, depression is an elevated cortisolemic state and has DST abnormalities. There is, I mean, these are the findings from studies. There is an increased adrenal size and sensitivity to ACTH, blunted ACTH response to CRH, elevated CRH. So basically, the whole system is overworking. And because of this, there can also be a propensity to psychosis. So lithium, carbamazepine, and valproate inhibit transcription activity of GR, glucocorticoid receptors. And there is some role of CRH1 antagonists. These are experimental, but the first three which we are using daily, we need to have faith in those molecules and not really shy away from using them when there is a need. In PTSD, there is hypercortisolemia leading to hippocampal cell death. There's an impaired cortisol negative feedback. In schizophrenia, the HPA abnormalities are associated with negative symptoms and cognitive impairment. And clozapine prevents or reverses cortisol-induced hippocampal damage and reverses impaired LTP. So apart from the dopamine blocking activity of clozapine, I mean, which we know as a predominant antipsychotic activity, novel antipsychotic and all, it has this kind of an effect. It's got neuroprotective effect on the hippocampus. When we come to substance use disorders, again, there is a overstimulation of dopamine and motivational change. There is a pseudo-Cushingoid state we know with alcohol. And CRH plays an extra hypothalamic role in relapse. So this is when patients have been studied as to why they have a problem with motivation and why there are persistent relapses. And as I said, metabolic syndrome, glucocorticoids interfere with glucose transport and utilization. So there is insulin resistance. There is reduced lipid deployment. So there is lipid accumulation. We came to know these things, or rather we took an interest in all these things. It was always there when the atypicals came into the market. The idea is that we look at, I'm not a part of this topic, but we look at CRP, C-reactive protein, which is a inflammatory marker. But that is one way of looking at the HPA axis. The other way of looking at is the basal hypercortisolemia. Yes, it has got an effect on appetite also. So this was an older study, 2001. Stress may add bite to appetite in women. So hypercortisolemia, increase in appetite and eating behaviors. This was a very simple study done, but we have not found much difference right now. There is stress-induced eating amidst the current pandemic also going on. Again, the same kind of things are there. Stress-induced disruption, HPA axis-related disruption At a hypothalamic level, appetite centers get impaired, people eat more, apart from the other metabolic changes. So we have got obesity, hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular events, and so on and so forth. Another thing, which again is not a part of this thing, is that, and which I am going to emphasize here because it's going to come again and again, is the role of the gut bacteria. The gut microbiota in brain function and stress-related pathology. The gut, the residual, the resident pathogens, not pathogens, the resident bacteria, different genus of all those ones in the bacteria, they produce by themselves a lot of hormones, neurotransmitters, chemicals, which have an impact on the HPA axis, and so the final working on the brain. And this is not only related to food. Again, this is genetic. Again, there are a lot of other factors involved. And so the stress response is also determined by the role of by this gut bacteria. It's not only what is processed at the higher centers, but even at the gut level. And when we look at psychoneuroendocrinology, we'll come to know after a point in time that everything appears similar. Whatever hormones or whatever hormonal effects we are going to look at will probably have an effect on appetite, on thirst, on sleep, on memory, on sexual behaviors. All of them are related. The second is the hypogonadal axis, the gonadal axis, the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis. Well, again, we have the release hormones, that is the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the arcuate area of hypothalamus, stimulated by norepinephrine. The feedback is by gonadal steroids. Finally, those are produced. GnRH is associated with depressive states and it reduces libido. So it's one of the treatment modalities using in paraphilias. The gonadal hormones, that is the final products of the system, they are responsible for the development of sexual dimorphism in the brain. So the masculinization or the feminization of the brain, as we understand, development of the hypothalamic nuclei, there are size variations and functional variations. The corpus callosum, the temporal cortex, and the Broca's area. Estrogens are associated with developing an excessive sensitivity to serotonin, and this is the basis for using probably SSRIs when it comes to premenstrual dysphoric disorders. Testosterones are anabolic and androgenic. They improve sexual desire in both sexes. They have got both genomic and non-genomic actions, but the exact role in aggression is yet unclear. There have been inconsistent increases reported in schizophrenia patients, PTSD, depression, and anorexia. However, anabolic steroids, that those are the ones that are synthetic and are taken as supplements, are often associated with aggression, mood, and psychotic disturbances and substance dependence. Now, there is this adrenal androgen, which is called as dihydroepiandrosterone. This is an androgen which is produced by the adrenals, and it is also controlled by ACTH, and there is some synthesis in the brain. Now, this androgen is really something to look at because it stimulates or improves the activity of hippocampus and amygdala. It is also it will help in cortical synaptogenesis. It can help in reduction of antipsychotic drugs induce EPS. It may reduce ADHD and can improve mood, fatigue, and libido in HIV patients. These are all findings from various studies. Anti-glucocorticoid effects. Now there is a ratio. If we are able to determine the ratio of the cortisol, that is the product of the HPA axis, and DHEA, that is the product of this axis, this lower the number means there is a buffer against the negative effects of stress, as in PTSD. Estrogens and progesterone, these are basically cyclical and related to specific phases like PMDD, postpartum disorders, postmenopausal disturbances. Estrogens will stimulate dopamine synthesis. Estrogens are a little bit more important when we are dealing with proper main or let's say hardcore psychiatric illnesses. Antipsychotic effects vary over the menstrual cycle. There are some studies for that. Tardive dyskinesia is related to estrogen levels. Lower levels of estrogen are associated with acute psychosis and more negative and cognitive signs and symptoms. there is reduced risk and delay of onset of Alzheimer's in postmenopausal women. And as I mentioned earlier, they increase the sensitivity to 5-HT by reducing MAO activity. And so they are involved probably in the recurrence of postpartum disorders and have a role in SSRI augmentation with estrogens. And the effects may be mediated through BDNF and neuropeptide Y. So there was a study, and still people are dealing with this or trying to deal with this. Should psychiatrists be prescribing estrogen therapy to their female patients? Because as I said in the previous slide, because of all these effects, whether it is to reduce tardive dyskinesia or to bring down the psychosis or delay the effect of Alzheimer in postmenopausal women. So what has been found? PMDD responds positively, yes, because it is tightly linked to the estrogen activity over the cycle, over the monthly cycle. There is preliminary support for postpartum use and perimenopausal depression, but it is preliminary support. We need to wait for more studies and guidelines. There is limited support for adjunct in psychosis, and it may reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease, but the therapy has to be done in a critical period, that is around the menopause, not when an individual develops initial symptoms of Alzheimer's. So this was a study in BJP in 2013, and then people are carrying on with that, and there is now effect of estrogen replacement therapy on Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, a meta-analysis which was earlier this year, 2020. Well, the conclusions are more or less similar, that we need more studies, but what they're trying to say is that it is not, it may be of help, so we really don't read too much into it right now. Progesterones, they are GABA agonists, so they are anxiolytic and hypnotic. They are co-localized with 5-HT in the median raphe. Now, any hormone that is co-localized with a known neurotransmitter, like maybe dopamine or progesterone in case of 5-HT, they will modulate the activity. Progesterones have got an anti-estrogenic effect, but they are associated with dysphoric mood. Again, role in PMDD, postpartum disorders, and substance use disorders. We also have pregnenolone and allopregnenolone. They are modulators of GABA-A, NMDA, sigma-1, 5-HT3, and so on and so forth. Now, what we are actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis, prolactin. Now, even if you are not looking at other hormones of the HPG axis, this is the one which is going to trouble us on a daily, regular basis. So basically, prolactin is an anterior pituitary hormone. It is under dopaminergic inhibition. So the more we block dopamine, the more it is released, and we have all those prolactin related sexual side effects and other effects. But other releasing modifying factors are estrogen, 5-HT, 2 and 3, norepinephrine, opioids, TRH, T4, histamine, glutamate. So our poor antipsychotics are not the only agents to be blamed for this. As I said, antipsychotics, yes, but in the bargain, we do not look at many other things. High prolactin levels are associated with reduced libido, depression, stress intolerance, anxiety, irritability, and there is a positive correlation with tardive dyskinesia and negative symptomatology. So this is from our favorite book, the Maudsley 13th edition, which gives us the level here of what we need to look at if we are going to get a test done. Well, these are guidelines, so we do not really go by each and everything. We try and modify it according to our patient. But the idea is that when a patient is definitely on antipsychotics, we need to inquire about sexual side effects, and if necessary, go for testing. Here they have given the whole chart of how to go about testing and all, but the important things are these. These are the antipsychotics, which are prolactin sparing, which are of importance right now: aripiprazole, azinapine, brexpiprazole, cariprazine, clozapine, iloperidone, and quetiapine. Supposed to have minimal effects on increasing prolactin. So when a patient has hyperprolactinemia, what do we do? First choice is aripiprazole. Before we actually think of sending the patient for gynec evaluation, after we do a prolactin, of course, the first thing would be to add low dose aripiprazole. The second choice is then the treatment which they give, cabergoline, bromocriptine, and so on and so forth. But as I said, what is also important is that antipsychotics are not the only agents which are associated with an increase in prolactin. SNRIs, SSRIs, tricyclics, also have been associated and implicated with an increase in prolactin level. So we do not have to have a knee jerk. We need to look at the whole list of medication that the patient is on, and then we'll be able to understand probably why this is happening. The third major axis is the HPT axis, that is the hypothalamo-pituitary thyroid axis. This is again the same kind of thing. Higher centers stimulates hypothalamus, release hormone, tropic hormone, and final hormone. And these hormones will act on the target organs. And then there is a feedback, short feedback, intermediate feedback, and a longer feedback. And here between the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, there is also the involvement of somatostatin and dopamine. So both will have a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Right? This is a little bit more fancy diagram, but what is important is the part which is here. So both T4 and T3 need transporters to get into the cells and then finally act on the receptors that are TR, alpha and beta on the nuclear membrane. Okay, that is important because, yeah, this is a rough diagram. So there is a transporter which will take the T3 or T4 inside and inside the nuclear membrane, and then the effect will happen. Now, why it is important is that thyroid disorders, especially when they are resistant, then when people have studied the different receptors of the thyroid hormones. So when there is the alpha receptor which is resistant, there's a problem in the polymorphism, then a lot of other things in addition to impaired neural development, abnormal cortical layering and cerebellum development will happen. This is the alpha variety of receptors and this is the beta variety. So the idea is that thyroid issues are not only associated with the typical signs and symptoms that are taught to us, but a lot of other things also. So basically this axis is concerned with food metabolism, temperature regulation, and it determines the rate of secretion and metabolism of all major hormones. So the whole system is kind of controlled by the thyroid axis because it decides kind of what is the energy requirement of each and every component of the body, each and every component of the cell, each and every component of the system. The T3 is more potent than T4 and it is obtained from T4 in the periphery and the brain. The CRIF, the corticotropin release inhibitory factor or somatostatin, is derived from prohormone TRH. And this is where the two systems, the HP and the HPT, are kind of integrated. Receptors I told about. Stimulated, TSH is stimulated by norepinephrine neurons and inhibited by dopaminergic neurons. Okay. So TSH affects gene expression and synaptic remodeling. It affects neural excitability and the acetylcholinergic and dopaminergic systems. Hypothyroidism may lead to synergistic cardiotoxicity in patients who are receiving MAO inhibitors and tricyclics. Anti-thyroid antibodies are found in some women with depression and may lead to treatment resistance in postpartum disorders. Now, why did I put this point? There is one thing is that whenever we are assessing for thyroid function, it is also important that we don't only stop at T3, T4 and TSH, but we also get the anti-thyroid antibodies into the picture. That becomes important from a lot of other disorders. Now, why is this diagram here is because of this thing, that cortisol in circulation has an inhibitory effect on TSH. So one was that somatostatin and TSH related effects. And this is the second one where these two axes come together, the HPA axis and the HPT axis. In depression, a lot of thyroid abnormalities are described. Low CSF thyroid, basal T3 inversely related to time of episode, basal TSH positively correlated with overall severity. Antidepressants, lithium is reduced T3 for TSH, increased TSH. With lithium, even subclinical changes may be relevant. These are described. These are very well known. And so, if anybody wants to really, augment antidepressant strategies with T3, then this is what we are looking at right now. We'll not go into the details, but yes, we can augment. There are studies. This is as late as 2017. Thyroid's neighbor is parathyroid. Hyperparathyroidism is associated with lethargy, stupor, and coma. Hypoparathyroidism with cognitive impairment, psychosis. Parathormone impairs uptake and release of norepinephrine and dopamine. Lithium increases serum calcium, may increase PTH over a period of time. Now, this parathormone, vitamin D3, and calcium metabolism is something that we need to understand. Unfortunately, we cannot go into much details beyond this. But only supplementing calcium or only supplementing D3 without an assessment of parathyroid status may not be a very useful strategy for correcting the overall impairments that happen when low vitamin D3 is there or low calcium is there. This also needs to be taken into account. Then we come to this group of hormones which are POMC growth hormones. Pro-opiomelanocortin is something like this. It's a huge polypeptide chain, protein chain, and then finally it produces these hormones: melanocyte stimulating hormone, ACTH, beta endorphin. These are the final end products. So these are all sisters of the same mother. So what is melanocortin? It stimulates sexual desire. It is protective for ischemic neurotoxicity. And there are n number of receptors. So melanocortin type 4 receptors, when they are blocked, it ameliorates cocaine effects. And also B5 type 5 block is associated with reduction in aggression. This is one of the hormones that is derived from POMC. Okay, this is the complex control. So has an effect on immunity, that's inhibition of the inflammatory response genes, central neurogenic anti-inflammatory effects. This is what it actually does. This is as I said, that when we're looking at this kind of hormones, they have got multiple effects. They'll have effects on vital body functions, on immunity, on vegetative functions, and so on and so forth. Melanocyte stimulating hormone associated with circadian rhythmicity. Phenothiazines can sometimes stimulate MSH and lead to hyperpigmentation. So the good old chlorpromazine, there are many patients who would complain of darkening of skin. It has an effect on mood states. MSH stimulates leptin and inhibits neuropeptide Y. So it reduces food intake and increases expenditure of energy. And antagonizes anti-anxiety, antidepressant effects of neuropeptide Y. So we look at melatonin because this is again something that we use in our daily practice. So it's derived from serotonin, and it is a kind of melatonin is one which is definitely circadian in nature. So the peak is obtained at between, let's say, at around 2 a.m. in a normal individual. This is important because the main peak functioning of melatonin is at that time. And of course, that becomes a marker if we are looking at rhythm disorders, circadian rhythm disorders, whether we are able to assess melatonin in plasma or saliva, or the metabolite, that is 6-sulfatoxymelatonin in urine. This can become markers when we are treating such individuals. A very complex kind of thing, because here we are dealing with melatonin, which is a hormone, which is dealing with circadian rhythmicity, and which is dealing with a lot of other things. So the one here basically gives an integration of how MSH through its M1 and MT2 receptors has an effect on the clock genes here. Here, this is the retinal melanopsin. So the amount of light, the type of light falling on it will stimulate, and then there is a control by the melatonin. Here, this one. So there are n number of effects of melatonin except this diurnal rhythmicity. Some of these are dependent on the receptors M1, M2, M3, and some are independent of the receptors. So basically it is enzyme regulation, immune modulation, antioxidant enzyme regulation, retinal physiology, circadian modulation, sleep, bone growth, blood pressure, alcohol toxicity, drug toxicity. All these multiple functions are mediated by melatonin. So modulation of immunity, mood, and reproduction. antioxidant, free radical scavenger, and oncostatic, neuroprotective, and thereby reduce because it reduces excitotoxicity, and it is an analgesic, so modulates opiate and 5-HT actions. Come to endogenous opioids. The opioid receptors are present throughout the nervous system, right from the cortex to the peripheral nerve, and different kinds of opioid receptors are present. This is a diagram to show the different distribution. OPRM1 will be mu receptors, OPRD1 will be different kinds of receptors, the sigma receptors, kappa, and different distributions. So if we see the red ones, they're different everywhere. The blue ones are different everywhere. Beta endorphin has an effect on stress, appetite, learning, memory, motor activity, and immunity. It co-regulates locus coeruleus along with CRF. In PTSD, there is hypersecretion of opioids, and it is needed for adaptation to traumatic experiences. We know of naltrexone, which is used in multiple things. It's an opiate antagonist in autism, substance use disorders, and eating disorders, and various kind of difficult to treat behaviors. When we look at growth hormone, again, multiple effects on dopamine, 5-HT1D, any norepinephrine receptors. It increases lipolysis and ketogenesis. Its secretion is in response to GnRH, LHRH, and TRH, luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone. There is increased secretion in Alzheimer's, and schizophrenia is a marker for NE and prostaglandin function. There is hypersecretion of GHRH in depression, blunted response to clonidine in panic, and it is a secretagogue for ghrelin, so it increases the eating behaviors. Somatostatin is one hormone which is anti to all hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. So it is inhibitory to ACTH, TRH, growth hormone, prolactin, everything. It alters releases of catecholamines. It stimulates 5-HT release. It is reduced in depression. Because it is reduced in depression, we will have more of ACTH, thyroid abnormalities, and sustained elevation can be due to early stressful experiences. So when there were early life stressors, one we saw was there is a problem with the development of the HPA axis, and the second one is this somatostatin. Vasopressin is again a posterior pituitary hormone. We know it because it is associated with retention of fluid. It's associated with that, but that is only one of the actions. It is triggered by pain, stress, dehydration, increased plasma osmolality, and reduced blood volume. It controls ACTH release. It is antagonistic to ACTH, norepinephrine. It enhances consolidation and retrieval of memory. It is altered in depression and eating disorders. And there is polydipsia secondary to SIADH. And fluoxetine and other SSRIs will reduce vasopressin. So we have hyponatremia that occurs when there are SSRIs. Again, not related to SSRIs only. Oxytocin is one hormone which is quite well researched. So I'll give some data on oxytocin. Oxytocin and vasopressin have the same kind of genetics, similar kind of genetics. Now, lot of genetic studies have been done when it comes to oxytocin and vasopressin in autism, aggression, depression. We'll not go into any details, empathy, harm avoidance. So basically social behavior, schizophrenia. Okay. Oxytocin is very well studied from probably all aspects. So what is oxytocin release? What does it do? Anxiolytic, pro-social behaviors like maternal behaviors, pairing, bonding, cognitive impacts, cognitive effects on social memory, olfactory memory, anorexia effect, attenuation of HPA axis. What we need to understand is that the oxytocin system works on the context. So if the oxytocin system is affected by childhood trauma, for example, the same things will happen. The system will work in the same way. The contextual cues, since they are different, the individual who is supposed to be perceived as safe is perceived as unsafe or negative, and then it will lead to those kind of responses. So oxytocin working is basically contextually determined, and also over the lifespan. So in childhood, it is responsible for proper, basically the mother-child bond, social interactions in adolescence, in adulthood, sexual behaviors, aggression, bonding, pregnancy, lactation, play behaviors also. This is the, but it also has at a molecular level an effect on LTP. Now that is where proper psychiatry comes in. When there are issues with memory and learning, then one of the important factors is also oxytocin, because by its activity, it has an effect on LTP and subsequent behavioral changes. Oxytocin has an effect on all these things, on proliferation of neural progenitor cells, on cellular differentiation, survival, and pruning. This is, of course, a rat model, but there are studies which are being done in humans also. Okay. So it inhibits food and sodium intake, it facilitates pair bonding, it's anxiolytic, it's modulator of limbic dopamine. It mediates the effects of CRH on ACTH, it's reduced in autism and anorexia. Amnestic neuropeptides, so some kinds of memory are encoded well and some of them are not. So are we there when it comes to oxytocin? There is so much of data, but are we, really confident about using it? Not yet. The doses that have been used are traditionally 8 to 50 international units, and basically these are it is given intranasally, but it has been studied in all of these, on autism, schizophrenia. There's another one called as neuropeptide Y. Again, learning and memory, inhibitory feedback with insulin, increased by stress and steroids, and it stimulates norepinephrine. We come to this last group of hormones, which are technically associated with mainly feeding, satiety, blood glucose, but they are important from to us because they have got different kinds of activities in the brain. So we look at insulin. These are the insulin sensitive areas in the brain. So hypothalamus for homeostasis, hippocampus for memory, striatum for reward, inhibition, lateral PFC, sensory perception, insular cortex, attention, fusiform gyrus. So these are the areas which are insulin sensitive in the brain. So it's not only about glucose metabolism and high blood glucose or low blood glucose, but a lot of other things also. There is insulin is also associated with energetics. So because glucose is necessary for the activity of all cells, it's the energy providing molecule. So it is important that we have a look at this diagram. We may not go into details. This is the insulin receptor. This is insulin and the receptor, and this binding, and it evokes a brief mitochondrial hydrogen peroxide activity, which when exceeds, there is a phosphorylation of the receptor, so it stops functioning for a time. So it is a very tightly controlled receptor, but this is necessary for memory and mood. So psychotic stress can impair insulin sensitivity. Tricyclics may also have a similar effect. SSRIs can increase sensitivity. It is important in learning, memory, and mood. When we are looking at chronic disorders, especially neurodegenerative disorders, we are looking at brain insulin resistance. So with aging, with genes, with whatever our hormonal states are, we are predisposed to dementia, metabolic disorders, obesity, type 2 diabetes. So again, this is where this is one area, if you're able to read more, you'll understand how all these chronic neurodegenerative disorders, they come very close to other chronic disorders that people suffer from. Leptin basically is associated with a lot of these changes: lean body state, testosterone, free fatty acids, corticolamines, iron. Okay, but it is under the effect of all these factors: steroids, thyroid hormone, growth hormone, all other hormones. Right. This is the basic effect related to feeding. Okay. Leptin is basically secreted or excreted or produced by adipose cells. But what is it important? There is something called as leptin resistance. It is the end result of obesity. There is an impairment or in transport across the blood-brain barrier, attenuation in leptin signaling, inflammation, deficiency in autophagy, and other effects. So what is it important for? Regulation of food impact? Yes, it stimulates immune response, increases hematopoiesis, T cell activation, phagocytosis, affects the HPG axis. There is an effect on the LHRH. Low leptin levels are associated with depression, and high leptin levels can be associated with serotonin dopamine antagonists. Neurotensin is a signaling molecule. Again, another one is orexin. Orexin is a hormone which is secreted by this lateral hypothalamic area. Again, supposed to be strictly related to only feeding, but it has got a variety of effects on emotion via amygdala. It is affected by emotions via amygdala, suprachiasmatic nucleus. So there's a circadian rhythmicity, GABA, and has an effect on arousal, feeding, reward, and thermogenesis. Okay. The receptors are widely distributed in hippocampus, type 1 paraventral thalamic nuclei, ventromedial hypothalamic nuclei, and type 2 receptors. Okay. I will not go into all these things. It was in the diagram. Then there is ghrelin. Okay, ghrelin is another one which is a hormone which is secreted by the GIT. Again, it is supposed to increase eating behaviors, but again, apart from food intake which is increased, it is also stimulatory for ACTH and growth hormone. It has an effect on circadian rhythm control, reward, inflammation, on insulin itself, and cardiac activities, on the cardiac functioning. What is important is this: ghrelin is important for proliferation, cellular proliferation, cell death, pro-inflammation, neuroprotection, and memory. Galenin, again, it is a peculiar polypeptide which is produced only under situations of stress. Associated with limbic dysfunction, once it is produced, neuroplastic changes in monoamine deficiency. This is a newer theory for depression. People are looking at maybe if we're able to block galenin expression, whether we are able to treat depression or anxiety better. Cholecystokinin, again, it's a peptide. Now this cholecystokinin is released from the gut mainly. Limbic system and hypothalamus, it regulates inhibition of intake of solid liquid food, production of satiety, pain relief, cardiovascular respiratory function, neurotoxicity, reproductive behaviors, memory. There are different types of receptors. Now, most important is this last point, that it coexists with dopamine in the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, and it can modulate the activity of these along with activity of neural nerve growth factor and HP activity. Now, what this means basically is that patients will develop EPS less, maybe develop negative symptoms less. So CCK-A receptor antagonists have been proposed for treatment of schizophrenia, B antagonists for anxiety, and maybe for substance dependence also. Again, experimental, we are not there yet. Then we have this gastrin and gastrin releasing peptide. Now, why I put this here is because we need to understand that this last group of hormones, we always thought that they mainly had effects on GIT, feeding. They have got multiple effects, not only related to the GIT or endocrine, but even development, immunity, memory, and things like that. So, what are the clinical implications? Last slide. Well, we need to understand this better, because if you're going to tailor the response. It is not only the CYP450 which is important when it comes to drugs. If we have markers based on this, we are understanding now, as I said, that this basically is a system that is a group of systems that we are understanding. We are not there yet completely, but if we are able to have markers for that, we'll be able to treat patients better. Maybe we'll also be able to develop drugs on these strategies and not only really focus on the neurotransmitters. Thank you. And if there are questions, I'll take them now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Pralay. It was exhaustive, to say the least. And here we were thinking it's just about serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. You have surely set the cat amongst the pigeons, and we know now that it's a lot more than just these simple hormones or neurotransmitters that we are looking at. I would like to throw open the forum for everybody now, and we would encourage you to actually post your questions on the chat box. I will try and do justice to everybody as much as I can. We'll start with the first question. Any effect of female gender hormones on sleep? In the book Clinician's Guide to Sleep Disorders by Watson and Walker, it is mentioned that female gender is a risk factor for insomnia. What do you have to say, Malay?
Not necessarily, because it is, again, as we have seen in the presentation, that how do I get off this screen sharing? I'll just remove that.
You need to probably press stop screen sharing.
Yeah, stop sharing. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, now we are good.
So yeah, so it is not only the female sex hormones that are sort of involved in the circadian rhythmicity, as we saw all these other ones, whether it is leptin, whether it is orexin, whether it is in ACTH, they are all associated with this sleep patterns. So it is not the only factor, the female sex hormones, that are predisposing them in any way, or they are the only ones responsible for sleep issues. Otherwise, we would have about half the population having insomnia, which is also in fact.
All right. We have another question from Jayesh, who asks why prolactin raised in hypothyroidism when cells are different.
It is like this. To understand it very simple, in very simple terms, it is that even though cells are different, they are going to have the transporters. Now, when we talk of thyroid hormones or whatever, the thyroid hormones are acting on all the cells of the body, whether they are in the brain or they are elsewhere. An optimum level of functioning is needed for the systems to work well. If there are differences, if there is a change, then they will not work properly. So even though the cells are different, they are still connected. That is the overall framework of PNE.
Okay. And then there is another interesting question. What estrogen to prescribe and how much during menopause?
I'm not the right person to answer this. You will need to. And the second thing is that again, the hormone replacement therapy is not the sort of the panacea for preventing a host of problems. In fact, in susceptible women, it can also predispose to carcinogenicity. So we should be careful. I will not venture into that, how much, when, and whom. The best persons, those who deal with the female endocrinology, the gynecologist, or the endocrinologist themselves, because they'll be able to assess better.
Right. All right. Mirtazapine and TSH is a question which Anjali has asked. So I don't know what exactly is the question, but maybe if you can read something into it.
What was the question? Just let me see.
Mirtazapine and
Yeah.
TSH. That was the only question.
Yeah. So the idea is that well, depression by itself is associated with subnormal or subclinical hypothyroidism in some patients. There have been studies which have tried to bring this kind of an association, so that in some patients, if you start uh, and the testing, and you probably understand that this is a different group of patients and they'll need to be treated. Now, in that is not so. It's not a very robust marker, so to say. But yes, what we need to understand is this: that in depression, yes, may be associated with TSH. Uh, it can be an independent thing also. So now about mirtazapine, um, any uh, any medication which blocks D2 can also suppress the hypothalamo pituitary thyroid axis. That is the things that I had mentioned in my presentation. But mirtazapine is not going to affect the dopamine in any way. This mainly the novel antipsychotics. There have been studies where novel the SDAs, some of them have been associated with an increase in TSH and hypothyroidism studies. I'll leave it.
We have a question from Asma who asks, what's the role of addition of modafinil in a patient on antipsychotics or a patient with depression? Does it improve daytime alertness?
It can. It is a clinical question, so I will put it this way: it can increase, but we also need to understand the mechanisms of why it is happening. It can improve alertness, yes, but whether it is going to change the biology of the individual as regards the illness that he is suffering from, now, whether it is psychosis or depression or bipolar or whatever, that is a different thing.
Okay. We have Prashant who's asked this question. So many gut hormones affecting the brain. Does that make gut microbes as a candidate neurobehavioral Jungian archetype?
What is that?
I hope I'm reading it right. Does that make gut microbes as a candidate neurobehavioral Jungian archetype?
Well, there is nothing Jungian about the gut microbiota, because this gut microbiota we are just begun to understand. So anything we don't understand, we don't attribute to anything. I mean, it is not so. There are millions of different types of gut bacteria, and it is like to put it in very simple terms, these gut bacteria are all individualized. Means my gut bacteria will be different from my mother's gut bacteria, my sister's gut bacteria, my parents' gut bacteria. So it is like an individual fingerprint, or maybe to put it in more technological terms, it is a individualized retinal scan kind of thing. So it is not a collective. It is different. And what people have understood now, at least we have begun to understand, is that um, we are not completely sure, but in different types of disorders, certain kind of bacterial populations increase. In some, certain kinds of populations decrease. And it is not only a matter of eating curds, or it is not only fecal metabolic, fecal microbial microbiota transfer kind of thing. Unless and until we know these individual signatures, we will not be able to really customize gut microbial therapies for patients.
All right. Joyita has a question for you. What is your experience with melatonin, and what would you advise for regular clinical practice?
Quite a few of my patients are on melatonin, and they are on melatonin for what? Sleep issues. So when a patient has got insomnia, a milder variety, not really related to anxiety, it becomes my first choice to start with. Of course, I might change. I start with 3 mg and I have gone up to 9 mg. Anything more needed, we might shift into other areas. So one is for sleep, second is in delirium patients. I find it useful in delirium patients along with whatever we are treating, because delirium is a problem which happens when there is those patients are in the same environment. There is a problem with the circadian rhythmicity, light entering and all. That is where it helps. Third thing is in sleep disorders. Yes. Fourth thing is in patients who have dementia, and in many times when we are giving them low dose antipsychotics or low dose benzodiazepines, they become more confused. In those situations, I prefer melatonin to benzodiazepines. That is where it works. So yes, we
Great.
can use a lot of it. I mean, the only thing is that this is there is some family physician who had brought it to my notice that can we give melatonin, the preparations that are available in the market, to vegetarians, because apparently the source of melatonin is non-vegetarian. So I don't know of anything yet. There's another molecule called as Remeltion, which was acting on the melatonin receptors, a synthetic molecule, which is I am not sure whether it's available. And then we have an antidepressant which is called as pitolisant, mild antidepressant activity plus sedation, but again not so much of sleep. Yes, melatonin we can use.
Thanks, Malay. Somebody who goes by the pen name of Realme C1 wants to ask you, how about the connection of headache to this neuroendocrine system?
Headache again is not one thing. Headache is not one thing. Headache is a group of disorders with different etiologies in different settings. So, in one word, the answer is yes. There is a whole lot of uh, psychoneuroendocrinology involved.
All right. And then we have Ashutosh who wants to know, vitamin D is D3 is a neurosteroid. Would you consider it as a hormone?
I might as well consider any hormone as a neurosteroid or a neuropeptide, because the classification of these chemicals is technically on the systems that we have studied. So, yes, we can consider it as a hormone, no problem. So
Right.
I avoided getting into that, because then again it will go into a lot of calcium metabolism and things like that. So I was just happy putting parathormone here and just.
Right. I think we've kind of run through most of the questions. I will ask the host to unmute all of us. If anybody has any questions, then feel free to ask them. Otherwise, we'll all join in a round of applause for Dr. Malay for having done an excellent job and made this very complex situation seem simple, though I don't think it's simple enough for me. I'm still as confused as I was, but yes, definitely Malay has helped us a lot in understanding this a little bit better. So thank you very much, Malay. We are grateful to you for your eloquence and your lucidity as ever. And if there are no more questions, we can call it a day. And all of you, if you can join me in thanking Malay. Thanks so much, Malay.